Welcome to the Southern Blueprint Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Swift. This is part 2 of High Tide, High Times, which is all about the Gentleman Smugglers of South Carolina and Operation Jackpot. Of course, if you have not listened to part 1, you should probably go do that first and then come back to this one. But for those who have listened to part 1, I'll give you a quick little recap. We have Barry Foy and Les Riley, two guys from South Carolina who started to build their drug smuggling empire down in Florida, making marijuana runs to Jamaica and Colombia. But Florida was getting a little crazy at that time, so the men have now moved their operations back up to South Carolina. There was just a lot of competition in Florida. Everyone was running marijuana, it seemed like. But there was a lot more heat coming into Florida with the influx of cocaine. There was lots of violence and killing. So the South Carolina natives, who they never used guns themselves, thought it wise to move their base of operations back to the Palmetto State, using the familiar waterways, intercoastal channels, and utilizing old friends to help them with their operations. At the very end of part 1, where we left off, we have Les Riley, one of the Gentleman Smugglers, and he is living it up down in Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. And that's where me and my family like to go vacation every year. But Les, he was more laid back than the two between him and Barry Foy. Les, he had a family, and he was taking it easy, living off his smuggling money and all of his investments, and things were good for Les. And as I mentioned in the first episode, part 1, although Barry Foy and Les Riley were friends and indeed did a lot of smuggling together, they would also spend time apart and just kind of do their own thing. Both had homes in Hilton Head, but Les at the time was just, like I said, taking it easy. Though I think maybe getting a tad restless. But I ended episode 1 saying, after a day of drinking with his pal Wally Butler, who everyone called Weird Wally, and Wally was a friend and business partner of Les's down in Hilton Head. But Les said that he would make what he would call later that day the biggest mistake of his life. That mistake would be Lee Harvey, a figure that reappeared in Les Riley's relaxed world. Lee was an old college acquaintance and had been a familiar face around the University of South Carolina, remembered for his easy charm, constant grin, and the nickname Smiley. In college, he sold some pot and some hash oil, but he was never really as consumed by dealing as, maybe Barry and Les had been. And Les Riley himself remembered Lee Harvey as a good guy, fun to be around because all of the girls liked him. Lee had big ambitions, though. Lee had also been arrested and picked up quite a record. By the mid-1970s, he had drifted down south like most smugglers. He had also done some time in prison, but he was looking for a way back into the smuggling life at the time and make some real money. Lee Harvey sought out Les down in Hilton Head to pitch him on joining forces. Lee told Les, "Hey, I've got the people. You'll just teach me the business." Lee claimed that he had contacts eager to buy marijuana, and Les should and could bring him in as partners. For Les, Lee Harvey's arrival was, disruptive to his leisurely life. Yet Les admitted that he was a little bored. And as much as he enjoyed the peace of Hilton Head, there was a part of him itching for adventure again. Susan, Les's partner, she sort of sensed that too. So with Lee's persistence and Lee's own restlessness, it soon opened the door for Les to step back into the smuggling life he thought he left behind. Julian Purnell and Barry Toombs joined Les and Lee on this little business venture. The crew decided to move beyond boats and try their hands at aviation. The plan was simple. Use a plane to haul Colombian marijuana into the States, then move it by truck. Purnell and Toombs said that they had connections up north and had all of the distribution channels set and ready. On paper, it sort of made sense. A plane could do in hours what a boat could do in days. But Les Riley did understand that aviation brought a different kind of exposure. Boats could disappear into coves and marshes. Planes needed fuel, runways, a paper trail, flight pass, etc. Still, he agreed to participate, but on limited terms. Les would stay removed from the landing itself, and he just handled the logistics instead. His role would be, making sure that the aircraft was refueled down in the Bahamas and kind of greasing the wheels of customs officials to ensure the plane could pass through without inspection or anyone bothering them, or just have people kind of start looking the other way. Les would not be around when the plane touched down in the States and would not be part of the loading and unloading process. On March 6, 1978, their plan went into motion. Their crew selected what they believed was a quiet, private airstrip near Sylvania, Georgia, a rural town surrounded by pine forest and farmland. The location seemed ideal. It was remote, lightly monitored, and far from the major smuggling corridors of, like Florida. What the smugglers did not know was that law enforcement was already keyed up on this airstrip. The key figure on the law enforcement side was U.S. Customs Service employee named William A. Wallace Jr. Working alongside him was Claude Clarity, who was an agent with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. But more importantly, there was a pilot and a plane locator named Frank Landry. Frank Landry told William A. Wallace that some folks were looking for a clandestine landing strip in Georgia, somewhere quiet, rural, and somewhat overlooked, where, a marijuana plane could land and dump its cargo and, vanish. So William Wallace, he represented himself to the smuggling crew as a man who, controlled the public airport there in Sylvania, someone who could make this landing happen for him without questions, without interference, and without attention. And the smugglers believed him. So back on January 7th, 1978, Wallace met a group at the Savannah airport. And this group included Barry Toombs, Julian Purnell, Jesus Manuel Meacher, and the pilot Frank Landry, who was basically kind of like a spy, undercover operator who keyed, William Wallace up to this whole thing. So Wallace and Claude Clarity, they drove them about 90 minutes from Savannah to Sylvania Airfield. The group stood there for about 10 minutes looking around, looking over the place. It was quiet, isolated, and it was exactly what the smugglers, what they wanted. So the smugglers had a plan. Everything looked good to them, but the trap was set. So like I said, back on March 6, 1978, shortly after dark, the aircraft touched down with roughly 3,600 pounds of Colombian marijuana. Trucks were already waiting. The bales were transferred quickly and without incident. The engine started. Headlights cut through the darkness. Within minutes, the trucks were rolling out, and the feds moved in. So the agents moved in. They arrested everybody. They seized all the trucks before they'd even made it to the highway. Jesus was arrested. Julian Purnell was arrested, Barry Toombs was arrested, and old Lee Harvey was also arrested. Now, Les Riley, he avoided arrest because he was in the Bahamas and therefore insulated from the immediate possession and conspiracy charges tied to this airstrip seizure. And that distinction mattered enormously. Riley's absence meant that the prosecutors could not tie him directly to the load that was seized in Georgia. Les's exposure would come later when federal investigators started to build more of this kind of like network level case rather than relying on single busts. And right now, Operation Jackpot is not in effect, and actually, marijuana laws and penalties were not all that major in the 1970s. For Lee Harvey, for example, he was on parole. He has a record, and you would think this bust would be devastating, but under drug laws in the 1970s at that time, marijuana charges really carried a surprisingly light penalty. 1,000 pounds of pot could just bring like 5 years maximum, sentence. And often people would just do 2. And Lee Harvey kind of brushed it off. He said that, they're going to give me 2 years and I can do that standing on my head. But this Georgia bust, it didn't immediately dismantle the whole smuggling network. But what it did start to do, it started to put names into federal files. It confirmed that aviation routes were also being used. It started to expose organizational structure and not just possession of drugs. It started to demonstrate that these were not isolated operators. They were all linked and working together. And some of that linkage they started to figure out. It was like, Lee Harvey to Barry Toombs to the whole logistics and the pipeline up north, logistics to the money. And this is what would later allow federal prosecutors to start building conspiracy cases rather than relying on, kind of like one-off seizures. But let's go back to the bust. Lee Harvey, like I said, he was arrested in Georgia and was facing charges, but he was released on bond pending court proceedings. And rather than, laying low and, serving his time, Lee Harvey fled the country, traveling through the Caribbean down to Central America. Barry Toombs, also arrested. He also fled the country, and he ended up in Costa Rica. Now, he would eventually be extradited back to the States for trial, but that would come, years later. Les Riley, although on the Fed's radar for the time being, like I said, he was left alone. He knew he needed to get away from planes again and getting back to smuggling by boat, his bread and butter. But Les, I guess you could say, he was officially out of retirement. And you would think you would want to, with everything going on, this bust that happened, and you had seemed to have gotten away, you would think you would also want to lay low. But he was ready for his next big thing. By the late 1970s, the smuggling world along the South Carolina coast was changing. Marijuana had built the fortress, right? Boats from Jamaica, Colombia, and the Caribbean had made the Lowcountry a reliable pipeline. But the very success of those routes was beginning to work against the people who ran them. There were just simply too many loads coming in and out. Too many participants, too much attention. Federal and state law enforcement had not yet unified their efforts. Like I said, Operation Jackpot had not quite gone into effect yet, but seizures were increasing. Coastal runs required large crews and repeated exposure. Aviation, like we talked about earlier, there's just way more riskier. And then you had that bust in Georgia. So they were trying to figure out, okay, how can we limit the loads and so many people involved? How can we maximize space and money? And they found that in the form of hashish. It just offered a whole different profile. It was far more compact than marijuana, drastically more valuable per pound. It was easier to store, move, and hide. And it was capable of generating the same revenue with a lot fewer trips. That's exactly what they were kind of looking for. By the time hashish became part of the operation, the question was no longer whether to source it internationally, but where could they get it from? And that place was Lebanon. Les Riley linked back up with his good pal, Barry Foy, and the two men set their sights on Lebanon. Barry Foy's role in the Lebanon trip was more of an organizer and financier. He was responsible for, the capital, vessel acquisition, and, kind of the strategic direction. He was not going to be on the boat going over to Lebanon. Les Riley's role was, again, logistical and downstream. He handled kind of the coordination, the timing, the movement once the cargo returned to, back to the States. And at the time, Lebanon, particularly the Bekaa Valley, was one of the world's major hashish producing regions. Cannabis cultivation there had expanded dramatically during the Lebanese Civil War, which began in 1975. The central authority there had fractured. Enforcement had collapsed in large areas, and armed groups, controlled the territory. It was civil war there, and all that instability mattered. It created conditions in which large-scale hashish production and export could occur with, relatively little interference from like law enforcement or the government. So the crew needed a big ship for this run, and they were able to secure that in Spain. They found a ship called the Second Life, and as the crew got on board, they first sailed to Malta, where they were actually filming the movie Popeye, which starred Robin Williams. Now the crew, they stayed there for a few days. And there's some hilarious lore around the movie Popeye anyway. But apparently the crew was maybe part of the extras in the background. But if you've heard anything about the movie Popeye, there's this lore that there were a lot of drugs being used on the set of that movie, a lot of cocaine. And I highly suggest two references here. One, you should absolutely read the book called Jackpot, High Times, High Seas. It's by Jason Ryan. This book is incredible. There is so much more in here that I just can't get to in the podcast. I do reference this book quite a bit in this podcast. But I highly suggest reading that. There's so many other tales, but apparently after the crew got this boat, they sailed to Malta. They were on the set of Popeye. And then later after that, they also get caught in a sandstorm, which sounds ridiculous as they're sailing. They're out at sea, but they get caught in a sandstorm. So again, this whole voyage is full of just ridiculous nonsense. And again, this whole tale from front to back is basically just like a movie, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to tell this story. But anyway, they get caught in a sandstorm. They move past that, and then they finally get to Lebanon, and it's crazy. They like pull ashore while civil war is going on. But hilarious enough, like both sides kind of like, okay, hey, got a ship here. Need to load up some drugs and get them out here. So there's kind of like a ceasefire between the two sides. Because the thing is like drugs and drug money kind of fuel this whole civil war on both sides. So both sides know like, hey, let's pause for a second. Let's get these guys loaded up and ready. And get them out of here. And then we can, go back to, shooting each other and everything like that. Also, too, after they have loaded up this hashish and they're leaving Lebanon, on the way back, their masts snapped. There may have been a possible mutiny on board or potential mutiny. But in the end, they did make it back to the States, and the trip was highly successful and profitable. And I mentioned two references, and I said that you should definitely go read Jackpot by Jason Ryan. But also too, halfway through writing part 2 here, I came across another podcast called Carolina Crimes Podcast. Now they focus mostly, or I think entirely, on South Carolina true crime. But I stumbled across, they did a 4-part episode of Operation Jackpot. So I started listening to that show and also got some additional information and read some other sources. But I would highly suggest going to listen to their show too. It's a 4-part episode, and honestly, I probably could have made this at least 3 parts. And there's just so much more that I'm just not going to be able to get to. So I would go listen to that show, and I would 100% buy the book Jackpot by Jason Ryan. Again, you'll get the whole story, and you'll probably get a lot more information in those 2 sources than I could possibly give you. But I almost forgot the second source, but I wanted to give you that before we move on to the next segment of this show. As the smuggling operations grew richer, bolder, so did the egos. Barry Foy, once the daring and charming young smuggler, became more reckless as the money piled up. He flaunted his wealth, he burned through cash, and kind of carried himself as someone who was untouchable. But those same traits, the impulsiveness, the arrogance, the risk-taking, that began to sour some of his partnerships. By the late 1970s, men who had once been his closest allies started to drift away. If you remember Bob the Boss Byers, he was a key business partner, but he cut ties with Barry after one botched offload in Hilton Head. I guess Barry failed to show up at a critical moment in the operation, and it left, others exposed. Bob the Boss, he was disgusted. So he stacked Barry's cut of marijuana in a corner and just simply walked away, telling associates that the best revenge was simple. Just stop working with him. Julian Purnell and Barry Toombs also broke with Barry Foy after a deal unraveled in McClellanville. After that, there was a dispute over money, and according to later accounts, Barry Foy pressed aggressively for payment, but Julian Purnell and Barry Toombs, they turned him away. As one smuggler later put it, Barry Foy was burning bridges, but he had always believed he could build them faster than he could destroy them. All of this money was starting to generate some other problems too that I feel like a lot of folks that are in organized crime fall victim to. All this cash from marijuana and hashish, those were turning into fur coats, cashmere suits, thick gold chains, and champagne-soaked dinners. There were all these homes in St. Bart's and Nantucket They had Jimmy Buffett come and perform for them. And, I've mentioned Jimmy Buffett a couple of times. And a funny little side note before I go any further. In 1996, Jamaican authorities shot at Jimmy Buffett's seaplane, the Hemisphere Dancer, after mistaking it for a drug trafficker's plane. U2's Bono was also on board. Just thought I would throw that out there. You've probably, you've heard Jimmy Buffett's name before. You'll probably hear it again. But he was in the same kind of universe as Les and Barry and some of these guys. And there was a Rolling Stone article where Jimmy Buffett admitted to maybe he did traffic a bill or two in his day. But anyway, this money that was coming in, it bought a lot of freedom and a lot of extravagance. But it's also started to bring a lot of attention. And that's what I was kind of saying, like a lot of folks in organized crime, they kind of fall victim to the same thing. They get a lot of money and they don't really know how to hide it. And they kind of like flaunt it and show it off. And when you have that much money, it is kind of hard to hide it. These guys were buying all types of assets, and some of it was leaving paper trails. They were buying houses, planes, boats, businesses, and just, land. And these guys, on paper didn't have a job. Didn't have any like actual income coming in. Legitimately, I guess. So this all kind of started a problem for these guys. And I guess I want to stop for a second and put into perspective just how much these guys were making and just how much product was coming through South Carolina. So between 1978 and 1979 alone, the amount of marijuana moving through South Carolina was staggering. So between 1978 and 1979, you have Barry Foy and Tom Rode. They were coordinating these massive offloads, right? And I've said before, sometimes Les and Barry are together, sometimes they're separate, but Barry and Tom, they were partnering together. And so I just want to give you some stats here. So 8,500 pounds was brought into Hilton Head in the spring of 1978. 12,000 pounds were brought into McClellanville in the fall of 1978. 12,000 pounds was brought into Datha Island in June of 1979. And 8,000 pounds of drugs were brought into Edisto Island November 1979. So 8,500 pounds, 12,000 pounds, another 12,000 pounds, and 8,000 pounds. Just 1978, 1979, and just by Barry Foy and Tom Rode. At the same time, Les Riley and old Lee Harvey had moved loads of similar scale. So 28,000 pounds near Conway in January 1979. 19,000 pounds brought into Hilton Head in February 1979. And 9,000 more pounds brought into Hilton Head in the spring of 1979. So when you think of Hilton Head today, you don't really think about drug smuggling empire. But I guess it was perfect with all the little marshes and waterways. But that is literally tons of pounds coming into South Carolina. And again, when I started, episode, part one, when you think of drug smuggling, you think of, Florida. You would never think of South Carolina. But during that time, a ton of product was coming through McClellanville, Hilton Head, Conway. It's just crazy. And you've got I-95 that runs up through the state. It's a perfect highway to, utilize and to move product. But I just want to give you guys an idea of just how many pounds of drugs were being brought through those locations. And again, that's just what I could find for 1978, 1979. I've seen some conflicting data, but again, just want to get kind of a rough idea and the locations of where all this stuff was coming through. And I wanted to bring up all of the product that's coming through to kind of give you like a tangible, amount, because I want to paint a picture of all of this product is coming through. All of this money is being made. And this is not New York. This is not Florida. This is South Carolina. This is Hilton Head Island in the 1970s. Hilton Head today, yeah, there's all these lavish homes and, pretty upscale places there. But, back then, people with that type of money, the coats, the watches, the jewelry, the suits, that starts bringing in attention, right? We've kind of mentioned that. But then something happens in January 1981, and that is when Ronald Reagan takes office, and the war on drugs is full steam ahead. Do you remember the Just Say No to Drugs slogan? And I know some of you were part of the DARE program, and I know some of you took that pledge, and you definitely broke it. Shame on you. But anyway, Reagan comes into office, and he promises this more aggressive federal response to drugs and crime. And so, therefore, he starts putting together these task forces to take a bite out of crime. And he was looking for someone in the Justice Department, and he was looking for a U.S. attorney that was politically reliable and aggressive and willing to pursue high-profile cases, and comfortable coordinating across federal agencies. And South Carolina's Henry McMaster fit that bill. Now, funny enough, Henry McMaster went to school with the likes of Barry Foy, Les Riley. But under Henry McMaster's leadership, something new begins to take shape. It's not a single case. It's not a single raid, but a task force designed to dismantle an entire smuggling world. Now, again, at this time, too, you've got organized crime in New York. You've got all the drug cartels in Florida, Texas, places like that. But it's interesting that Henry McMaster from South Carolina starts to lead this multi-agency task force, and they call it Operation Jackpot. And it's headquartered in South Carolina. But of course, it operates, far beyond that. But it draws in all these agencies like the DEA, the FBI, Customs, and even the IRS and the U.S. Attorney's Office. And it has political cover at the highest levels. Like this mandate is coming from Ronald Reagan himself. So it takes this task force a little bit to get everybody on board together and actually start sharing information. I mean, these agencies were very much siloed and, kind of protective of their own turf and what they're working on. So it took a little bit of time for them to start sharing information. But this task force started looking at real estate, any large or strange purchases, especially ones that were cash transactions. So they started questioning real estate agents and eventually got a hit. They questioned a coastal developer, and he had mentioned that Barry Foy bought some land for $90,000 using an offshore account and company name. And I think I may have mentioned that before. And if not, what was going on as, Barry and Les Riley, they were pretty smart guys, and they started using, kind of fake offshore accounts name to start purchasing certain, assets. And so this task force, they had heard Barry's name before. Barry had a little bit of a record. If you remember the airport incident in part 1, where he was, approached at the airport, he threw the bag at the guy and took off running through fields and everything like that. But so they knew his name. And the task force also started using another tactic to kind of build their case as they kind of came across assets linked to all of these smugglers, and they simply just started seizing things. For the first time, prosecutors could seize assets tied to drug trafficking even before getting a conviction. And in some cases, they did it without ever securing a conviction. So Operation Jackpot embraces kind of this, I guess this style fully. They started seizing boats, houses were taken, land was taken, bank accounts were frozen, and it wasn't done quietly. It was very deliberate and public, and it was strategic. There was in Charleston, there was a restaurant called the 82 Queen that was seized because the building housing the restaurant was partly owned by Barry Foy. And so the task force also started building RICO cases. RICO lets prosecutors link seemingly kind of like separate crimes as one overarching criminal enterprise, allowing them to charge leaders and members in a single trial. Even if the leaders were not directly involved in every single act, they were able to link them together. And this was a massive tactic for law enforcement, especially in New York for organized crime. So hypothetically, say, somebody gets picked up on a charge, right? But they've been linked to a crime family or a group of people or a crime boss. Now that crime boss and the people that are involved in this organization are all now on the hook for this thing, and kind of vice versa. The person that's picked up, law enforcement can be like, hey, I know we got you on this possession charge, but also you are part of this criminal organization, and it's been linked to, these other crimes. Now you're facing this because it's a conspiracy and everything like that. And so that kind of makes people perk up, like, wait a minute, I'm now being attached to all of these other things, and all those other things lead to additional years of jail time. And so that is when people start taking plea deals and running their mouth and ratting out people. Operation Jackpot starts utilizing this tactic, like I said, that's been used now in, places like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Florida, under, against the mafia and stuff like that. But now they're utilizing this same tactic for the smuggling empire coming out of South Carolina, and it's highly effective because, like I said, you could pick somebody up on a possession charge that's not a lot per se, but you can tie them to like their partner. And again, you had the bust that happened in Georgia, and now the feds are, and this task force is starting to put 2 and 2 together and start building this case. So now they can tie individuals to other people, and these other people are, higher up, and, they're bringing in more weight. And so you can tie these low-level people to these higher ups, and kind of vice versa, like I said. And with that extra added weight, no pun intended, you can start flipping people. And so they start utilizing this tactic, but also Operation Jackpot, they get a break. A local shrimper, he reported a sunken vessel where the mast was sticking out of the water. And so the feds go and check this out, and they pull up the ship, and on board this sunken vessel that looked like it was sunk on purpose, they found some evidence. And they also found a preserved, albeit, waterlogged document that had a phone number on it. And so this phone number belonged to a lady in Beaufort County. And so they go question this lady and her father. Now, her father is a dock builder. And so they basically tell the officers that if they are after drug smugglers, they might want to go check out a very large dock that was recently built in Sea Pines in Hilton Head. Now, when my family goes down to Hilton Head, we stay in Sea Pines. And I think next time I go down there, I'm going to see if I can find some addresses and check some of these places out. But anyway, this lady's father, who's the dock builder, he basically has said that he had initially, turned down the request to build this dock. And the guy that asked him to do it was named Les Riley. Les had asked this guy to build this dock kind of hastily and, was like, hey, don't worry about codes and permits. I just really need this dock built pretty quickly. But Les had used one of the names of the offshore accounts. Now, I mentioned Barry Foy had done that before. Now, Les Riley is also using the offshore account name. And so now, again, you can start putting two and two together and start tying these things all in a nice little bow. So the officers, in this task force, they start pulling tax records for all of the properties tied to this offshore account name used for all of these business transactions. And most of them listed Wally Butler. Oh, Weird Wally. And most of these transactions listed him as the real estate agent, and then also Andy Parched as the attorney on record. So they go and question Andy, who's an attorney, and he at first he denied everything. But the task force get yet another break as Hank Strickland, a firefighter, was willing to talk as someone who had handled communications during some drug runs. Hank had played a small part in the smuggling, but enough to provide vital information. Now, again, with all of these new laws and rules, and you've got all these, task officers, in and around Hilton Head, which is probably not a normal thing, people start getting a little chatty and start giving some information up. But with this information that they get from Hank, and kind of corroborating some of the, drug smuggling stuff, and I'm sure Hank was able to provide some additional information. But with all this information, they were able to get a warrant for Andy's law office, the one who had denied everything. But once they had the warrant, Andy started talking. And so Andy started laying out all of Barry and Les's property holdings. And you might be wondering, where's Barry? Where's Les? Are they just hanging out in Hilton Head while all this heat's coming down? No, these guys, like I said, they had homes all over the world. They're always traveling, doing certain things. And I'm sure as they caught wind of these officers in Hilton Head, they probably went other places. But people were starting to talk. All these assets are being seized. People are starting to take plea deals as, again, they're getting tied to all of these other crimes. And people are just starting to talk. So needless to say, the walls are closing in on our gentlemen smugglers. Now, there's a guy named Willie Steele who had been arrested during this whole task force roundup operation. So he's incarcerated, but he reaches out to the DEA and said that they needed to come see him and you should bring a yachting magazine. that he had something to show them that was important to their case. So the officers, once they got there to Willie, they showed him the magazine. So Willie turns to the back where all the yachts and sailboats are, for sale. And Willie points to one and says, "This sailboat belongs to Bob the Boss Byers." Now, the officers perked up because Bob was one of kind of the bigger fish that this task force was looking for and wanted to get evidence against. And supposedly, this boat was used in a crime. So the officers, they posed as the buyers and went down to see Bob. And to make a long story short, they eventually are able to arrest Bob and tie this boat to him and to this crime. So they arrest Bob and they bring him back to South Carolina for trial. Now, Bob had been in jail for like a year. But Bob was getting out of his cell for, he had a doctor's appointment. So he's getting out of his cell. But as soon as Bob gets out of his cell, he makes a run for it out of the back of the jailhouse and out a door that had been left unlocked. He also gets into a Chevy Malibu, which the keys were still in there, and Bob took off. Clearly, this was an inside job, and that individual was eventually confronted and arrested, I guess trying to help Bob escape. So they're arrested. In about a month, they eventually track down Bob, who escaped, and they track him down to Colorado, all the way out in Colorado, and they arrest him. And once they arrest him, Bob gets a 33-year sentence. So now you got Bob in jail. Meanwhile, you have old Les Riley and his partner Suzanne and their kids. They're not in Hilton Head. They're not in the United States. They are in Australia. As the net was tightening, everyone was fleeing or trying to run as far as they could. Wally Butler, old weird Wally, was also in Australia, living right down the road from Les. But on May 5th, 1983, Operation Jackpot, they found old Les. Australian federal officers had been watching him after the Americans had told them who he was and that they wanted him extradited back. They told, the Australian officers like, hey, this guy's a major drug smuggler. You should really go apprehend him and hold him until we can get him back to the States. So after one day, Les takes the kids to the school. The officers approach Les. Les, not knowing who in the hell these plainclothes people were, they asked to speak to him and try to grab Les, and Les ran. There was a lengthy foot chase, but eventually the officers cornered Les at a house out on a balcony. Les had run through this house and gotten up to the upstairs and was going to try to jump off the balcony there, but they drew down on Les, and he was arrested. And also that same day, old weird Wally was also arrested. So like I said, they were arrested in 1983, but they were extradited back until 1986, spending like 30 months in an Australian jail. Now, I don't know how jails are in Australia. That could be bad. It could be, it's just, kind of nice. I don't know. Maybe someone can tell me if they've ever been in an Australian jail, but they served 30 months in jail. But Les Riley, he never gave up anyone. They really wanted him to talk. He would have been a perfect one to talk. But it really just wasn't in Les's DNA to rat. And because of his reluctance to cooperate, Les got 25 years in federal prison and no parole. So you've got Les and Wally Butler in jail in Australia. But what about our boy, Barry Foy? So Barry was all over the place, gallivanting around. Barry is not the type of guy to lay low. As I mentioned earlier, he was more flamboyant than some of the others, spent a lot of money. You know, gallivanting is probably the best word to use for Barry. He was all over the place, like I said. But he was just coming back from Europe, and he was coming through Canada, and he had arranged a cab to bring him from Canada to New York and into the city. Barry had a lady friend with him. He also had a bunch of beer and a suitcase full of cash, because why wouldn't you? But the cab has to go through a checkpoint at the border, right? That's kind of, normal practice. And here's where things get a little dicey. As they're about to go through the checkpoint, Barry starts stashing this cash like in the seats before like Border Patrol can ask him to get out of the car. So he starts stashing all this cash in the cab, and I'm not entirely sure if he thought that through. I don't know, but anyway, he's stashing all this stuff, and he's going through the checkpoint. But they ask him to get out of the car. He's got a lady friend with him. He's in a cab. He's got open beer and a briefcase. And so they're like, "Yeah, we're gonna take you to the customs house, and go through all your stuff." So as they are doing this, Barry asks to go to the restroom. And while in the restroom, he starts storing more cash. And so after he does this and gets out of the bathroom, he makes a run for it. Barry runs for miles. He's running through fields. He's jumping in cow manure to get the scent off of him. And if this sounds familiar, it is. Remember the airport incident in part 1, where he kind of does the same thing. He runs away, runs through fields and all these roads, and but the crazy thing is he gets away, and he hitches a ride with a post office worker, claiming that his car had broken down and his wife was in labor at the hospital. Now, if you're wondering what happened to the cab driver or the lady he was with, I have no idea. I think it's pretty crappy that he just left that girl, I guess, at the customs house. I couldn't find out what happened. But anyway, Barry Foy, eventually, after getting this ride, he gets some fresh clothes, and then he's able to get a flight into New York City. Somehow he makes it through unscathed, but he gets away from this, which is absolutely hilarious. And again, kind of like a movie. This whole story from front to back is basically just a hilarious comedy, thriller, true crime movie. And I can't believe that they haven't tried to make like a feature film on this. It's that entertaining. But eventually, Barry Foy's luck would run out. Later in 1985, the task force was interviewing a lady in New York that knew Barry Foy. She was a friend. And as they were interviewing her, the phone rings, and it's Barry. That's a crazy coincidence, but they're interviewing this lady that knows Barry. They're trying to track him down. They know he's been in New York. And as they're interviewing this lady, the phone rings, and it's Barry on the other line. Of course, the officers start feeding her questions to ask Barry. And so Barry tells her he's coming back to New York from a ski trip with his family, and he needs a place to stay. And gave this lady a place of where he kind of wants to stay, and for her to get it ready for him. Now, this time he's with his family. Last time it was just some random lady. But they're on a ski trip. He's wanting to come back to New York, needs a place to stay. And so he's reached out to this lady to help him kind of facilitate that. Barry didn't say where he was, but that he was coming back into town, but he had to wait because there was a blizzard where he was. So the task force starts looking at where maybe there's some blizzards currently. And one of those places at the time was Telluride, Colorado. And of course, that's a major skiing destination. So they kind of put two and two together, and they're like, okay, he's probably in Telluride, Colorado. So the task force starts checking flights from Colorado to New York, and notice that one of the names on the flight passenger list is an alias that Barry Foy was known to use. So they see that Barry's going to be flying out of Denver, Colorado. And so they had an undercover officer set up in Denver, and they waited for Barry to fly out. At the airport, they spot Barry and his wife and kids getting on the plane. And so they get on the plane with Barry and his family. They fly all the way back to New York. And once they get here, they get off the flight, and they get ahead of Barry and his wife and kids and just wait for him to come out. Now, it takes a little bit for Barry and his wife and kids to come out, and they start getting a little restless, but they spot Barry coming out, and he's walking out in a full-length mink coat. And so again, Barry's not one to shy away and not wear extravagant things. So of course, they're all waiting in New York, and they approach Barry and arrest him right there on the spot. And Barry Foy would later be sentenced to 18 and a half years in jail. It's safe to say that Operation Jackpot was a massive success. No doubt they were able to extradite and convict pretty much everyone that was involved. But there was one guy that it took a very, very long time to apprehend. And keep in mind that most of these convictions, they came in like the 1980s, like the early 80s. But in 2008, a man named Robert Brunson was arrested trying to cross the border from Mexico into Southern California using a fake passport. Once arrested, his fingerprints linked him back to the old South Carolina smuggling charges and Operation Jackpot. So Robert ends up pleading guilty of smuggling marijuana and hashish into Hilton Head Island between the years 1974 and 1983. Now, he serves, I think it's like 9 months in jail for the fictitious passport, entering from Mexico into the United States. After that, he was then transferred back to South Carolina, and Brunson admitted that Lee Harvey had hired him and two other men, Kenneth Gunn and Christopher Campbell, to crew a sailboat named the Love Affair to bring in roughly 8,000 pounds of marijuana from Colombia to Hilton Head. Brunson also admitted involvement in importing approximately 30,000 pounds of hashish from Lebanon to Hilton Head in June of 1980. He said in this particular instance that he acted as a lookout in a small boat, kind of, anchored in the Sound, while the sailboat with all the product was offloaded. He then also admitted that he ended up driving the truck containing the hashish to a stash house. And I have to chuckle. That's an awfully long time to have gotten away with a pretty serious crime. But eventually, all things come to an end, and in 2008, Brunson was finally apprehended. And so you might be wondering what has happened to everyone else since the arrest and incarcerations. Well, Henry McMaster, who served as U.S. Attorney during Operation Jackpot and was in charge of the arrest and incarcerations. Today, he is the governor of South Carolina. Operation Jackpot became one of the most prominent cases of his tenure, and McMaster has repeatedly cited it over the years as formative in shaping his views on law enforcement, prosecution, and the use of financial tools like civil forfeiture. Then we have Tom Rhodes. He ended up being released in 1998, and he ended up dying in 2005 from a brain aneurysm. Then we've got Bob the Boss Byers. He ended up serving 18 years, and he ended up passing away in 2004. Next, we have Lee Harvey. And now Lee, he got one of the more harsher sentences. He got 40 years. And it was because not only the drug charges, he had a previous record too, but he also fled, if you remember. And he also picked up some weapon charges. And prosecutors, they argued he was a ongoing posing threat. So he ended up getting 40 years in jail. And then we got our buddy Les Riley. Now, Les, I think he was sentenced to 25 years, but he was released in 1999, serving 17 years of that sentence. So he didn't have to do the full amount. But he claimed that if everybody would have lived a more modest lifestyle, they may not have ever been caught, which I don't agree. I think with that much product coming into South Carolina, eventually it would draw attention, even if it wasn't from a task force, just local law enforcement. It was already starting to catch on. And I think it was just a matter of time. But he now lives down at Seabrook Island, which is down towards Kiowa Island. And then we have Barry the Flash Foy. So Barry only served 11 years. And all things considered, it doesn't seem like all that much in relative terms to everyone else. But regardless, he served 11 years. And now Barry is a legit businessman who runs this will not be a shocker to anyone, he runs a legit cannabis company, and it's called, get this, Gentleman Smugglers. It's based in Massachusetts, and you can go to their website. It's called gentlemansmugglers.com. And you can check out the website, but he's a legit businessman doing legal cannabis. And on the website, you could check out our story, and he kind of just breaks down how he, his telling of events. It's pretty fascinating. But Barry lives down in where else? Hilton Head Island. And that brings us to the end of this chapter in the saga of the Gentleman Smugglers and Operation Jackpot. This story of daring smuggling runs, of lavish excess, of fractures in partnerships, and a federal task force that refused to stop has been pieced together from decades of reporting, court reports, memoirs, and firsthand accounts. Two works in particular help anchor what you've heard today. First and foremost, the book Operation Jackpot by Jason Ryan. It's a book that chronicles not just the arrest and the trials, but it also talks about the strategy and the personalities and the evolution of federal prosecution that turned a quiet corner of the Southeast into the epicenter of a national crackdown. The book is absolutely phenomenal and has way more than what I could put in the show. The second thing, and I mentioned this earlier, is the Carolina Crimes podcast. Again, they focus on South Carolina true crime. They did a 4-part episode on this, and as I was halfway writing the second part, I stumbled across it, and they had a ton of info that I've read other places, but also some things I'd never heard before. So I included some of that in this show. But if you get a chance, go listen to their podcast in general. They do a really good job and cover a lot of really cool stories. And also, if you want to know kind of like a detailed look at the smuggling world itself, the boats, the crews, the routes, the culture, go to the gentlemansmugglers.com and look under our story. Barry Foy and the guys that run the new legit cannabis website kind of give you like a firsthand view from their perspective of who they were, for better or worse. Big thanks to my producer Corey for helping me get this show out, making it sound good. If you liked this episode and you liked part 1, please give the show a 5-star rating and leave us a review. That helps get the show out in front of more people. We're only 13 episodes in, so we're just really kind of ramping up, but that does really help get the show out in front of more people. If you want to discuss this episode or any of the episodes we put out, consider joining my Patreon. It's called The Hidden Pond Lodge. It's only $4 a month, and what you get is you get access to our community Discord, where we talk about the show, we talk about all types of other fun topics. But we also have a book club that's in there too, where we focus on books that relate to the South. But we pick a book every month and we talk about it and hang out at the end of the month and chat virtually, kind of a virtual hangout. But it's fun. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be posting additional content on Patreon. We'll have photos of the Gentleman Smugglers and some other little fun tidbits that I did put in the show. Again, it's only $4 a month. It's like a cup of coffee. And that helps fund the show. And I'll drop a link for the Hidden Pond Lodge in the show notes. But come check us out. Thank you all for listening. And guys, gals, I will see you soon.